Give me a cuddly little rascal.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Thor Love and Thunder is out, and boy was it a fun ride of romantic attractions, action adventures, and fun jokes along the way. Heavy spoilers ahead, so if you're watching this video and you haven't seen the movie yet, what are you doing, man? Go watch it. Thor Love and Thunder follows Gorr the God Butcher on an evil quest to slay the gods and avenge the death of his daughter. And Thor and Mighty Thor teaming up to take the scary man down and to save the life of all the gods. The anticipated release of the new Thor movie promised audiences the return of the wonderful Jane Foster as she turns into the Mighty Thor, and man did it deliver. Like any comic book movie of today's day and age, you're gonna see similar arcs from the comics, and events and characters drastically changed. With Thor Love and Thunder out, let's take a gander at what Marvel Studios took from the comics and what they left behind. I'm Joey C. Let's go!
No, give me that. You have the little one.
The Gorr the God Butcher of Thor Love and Thunder has some pretty large differences from his comic book counterpart. In both the comic books and in Love and Thunder, Gorr is a former mortal who lived in a dying world and lost faith in his gods due to the death of his family. In the comics, it was actually his wife and son who died, and in the movie, it was his daughter. Not sure why they changed it to his daughter, but anyways, he acquires the Necro Sword in both and vows to slay all gods. That is pretty much where all the similarities end. In the comics, Gorr looks less like a human like he does in the movie. He doesn't have a nose, and he has head tentacles. And that just sounds so gross. The director of Love and Thunder told IGN that accurately recreating Gorr from his comic book counterpart would look too similar to Voldemort. So I think they made the right move. When fans finally got to see the return of the famous Jane Foster in Thor Love and Thunder, it was a sad scene. It was very upsetting seeing Jane go through chemotherapy. Throughout her introduction, she seems pretty positive about continuing her work and life even though she has stage 4 cancer, which is pretty limiting, I suppose. Back to the comic book stuff, cancer sucks. In the comic book adventures of Jane, she is battling oh my god, okay, she's battling cancer in the comics as well. While Thor was away battling Gorr the God Butcher. She spends most of her time in New Asgard, where she is undergoing therapy, but she refuses to have magical treatment. I don't know why, that's just what she's doing. One thing's for sure though, Dr. Jane Foster keeps on fighting.
I feel like I'm losing it.
Get it together. You could do this.
Onward to the star of the film, Thor Odinson. In Thor Love and Thunder, both Thor and Mighty Thor exist at the same time. In the comic books, that is not the case, surprisingly. Thor became unworthy of wielding Mjolnir and was convinced the goddess of thunder was the worthy successor. Thor ditched his name and just became Odinson and went into exile. For most of the Jason Aaron comic run, Thor was absent and Jane took up his spot. MCU Thor, of course, never lost his worthiness. We even see an ongoing bit about Thor missing Mjolnir throughout the movie. Another massive difference is the comic book covers the Gorr and Thor saga throughout multiple timelines. The first battle takes place in the Viking Age, and then it goes into the 21st century, and then it goes into the distant future where Thor is an old man.
More on that later.
Thor Love and Thunder has some pretty brief flashbacks, but it sticks with the current time for the placement of the movie. Back to the beautiful Jane Foster for a moment. In the MCU, Jane tries to cure herself of the Big C, and she knows she's fighting against the biggest enemy of them all, time. She tries many things, but none of them seem to work for her, and she can feel Mjolnir calling for her from New Asgard. How that works, I have no idea. She makes the adventure to New Asgard to find Thor's destroyed hammer, and it reassembles itself right in front of her. The comic book adventures happen pretty similarly. Mjolnir telepathically seeks out Jane until she absolutely cannot resist it anymore. But Mjolnir was left abandoned on the moon after Nick Flippin' Fury whispered something into Thor's ear to make him feel unworthy of the weapon. That's just sad. But Jane travels with Heimdall to the hammer's location and becomes the Mighty Thor. That would have been so awesome to see in the movie. Let's give you a nice and short one here. Like I said before, in Thor Love and Thunder, we see Thor, Mighty Thor, and Valkyrie team up to defeat Gorr. The superhero trio of Asgardians make it their mission to rid the universe of the dangerous God Butcher. And side note, what an absolute unit of a name.
Gorr the God Butcher.
It's so violent. Anyways, in the comics, like we said before, Jane does not fight Gorr, nor does Valkyrie. It was just a solo match of the centuries between Gorr and Thor, and the fight takes place over several timelines, locations, and circumstances. In the movie, it basically all takes place at the center of the universe. My favorite comic book timeline is when Thor fights Gorr as an old man, and that would have been really great to see in the movie, but keeping it as one central battle keeps it nice and clean for the kids.
What are you doing?
Jane has quite the journey throughout Thor Love and Thunder. We see her cancer diagnosis, her traveling to Asgard, and her donning the famous Thor helmet. But the helmet is pretty much for fighting rather than keeping her identity a secret. In the comic books, however, it was surprising to find out that when Jane took up the famous mantle of Thor, her identity was kept a secret for quite a while. The way she spoke and the helmet she wore all helped to hide her identity as Jane Foster. Even Thor did not recognize her and introduced himself as Odinson, because like we discussed before, he felt unworthy of Thor. And that rhymed, baby. She hid her identity from the world for a long time, and she even hid her identity from the Avengers.
Oh, wait.
We got a wild change for you, my friends. One that I never heard of. In Thor Love and Thunder, we already see the love story between Thor and Mighty Thor, although there's not a large amount of time spent on it. The two share a few beautiful moments, and their chemistry is off the charts, and in our opinion, their romance and relationship adventures is the flagship of the series. However, in the Mighty Thor comic book run, Jane Foster doesn't have a romantic interest in Thor Odinson. At least, not until the end of her time as the hero. Instead, she feels a romantic attraction to Sam Wilson's Captain America. The two share a few romantic moments together in the comics, and even a few back at her place. It's not PG at all.
Let's kill him properly this time.
Let's dive a bit into Mjolnir, the all-powerful hammer of Thor. After being destroyed by Hela in Thor Ragnarok, the fantastically powerful Mjolnir was no more, and Thor replaced the mythical hammer with Stormbreaker. When Jane returned to New Asgard, Mjolnir was reconstructed and resurrected with new abilities to be able to shatter to defeat enemies and reconstruct itself. The comic book counterpart of Mjolnir does not share the same traits as seen in the movie. Like we mentioned, Thor was not worthy of the hammer, or so he thought, and Jane became worthy. The inscription on the weapon changed from "he be worthy" to "she be worthy." Very inclusive, my friends. We also mentioned it was left on the moon instead of New Asgard, but it's also important to note that the hammer did not receive new abilities when Jane took up the mantle of Mighty Thor. So we all know Jane Foster expires in the movie, and if you didn't, you do now. RIP. In Thor Love and Thunder, she perishes after wielding Mjolnir too many times. It progresses her cancer until she is far worse than what she was before picking up the hammer. The reason for this is that the magic needed for the hammer was draining her life force, which made her weaker against cancer. And that's just sad. She takes her last breath in Thor's arms and goes out as a god, entering Valhalla. The comic book version of Jane perishes, but for different reasons. Mjolnir was still the reason, but not because it drains her. During her chemotherapy, whenever she wields Mjolnir, it purges all toxins from her body, and this includes the chemotherapy drugs, making the cancer reach stage 4, the final stage. As Mighty Thor, her dying act was to save Asgardia one last time, but she is resurrected by Thor and Odin channeling the God Tempest. And finally, at the end of Thor Love and Thunder, Jane accepts her death and enters the gates of Valhalla. Here she is reunited with Heimdall and the rest of the Fallen. It's a very bittersweet moment in the movie, as the audience sees her move on to the next life, and we finally have closure for her character in her sad goodbye to the MCU. Speaking of the comics now, when Jane dies, she is more reluctant to enter Valhalla. Thanks to Thor and Odin, she was able to resurrect as a human. She is also promised to remain in chemotherapy. A long time after she beats the Big C, she looked over the bodies of the fallen Valkyries, where their spirits asked if she would become a Valkyrie. Her answer was yes, making her a Marvel superhero once again. Ladies and gentlemen, thems and theys, you made it to the end of the video. We greatly appreciate that. What did you think of Thor Love and Thunder? What did you think of the changes that the movie took from the comics? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, everybody, thanks for watching.